I want to talk a bit more about Operation Gladio. Probably if you had to listen to people at the time in the 60s and 70s and 80s when these political bombings were happening across Europe, I bet there were people at the time, independent journalists, who were screaming, uh, we need to investigate if these are NATO operations rather than something that was carried out by the communists. And I bet they were marginalized. But then once it started to be revealed in the various European countries in 1990, that yeah, they did have these stay behind armies. And investigators from the parliaments went out and looked and found the weapons caches hidden in forests, hidden in cemeteries. And once the people from the military started coming forward and saying, yeah, these programs were real, um, that kind of put it in to Operation Gladio. But at that point, we've really moved to a whole nother level because uh, they started to admit and it started to come out that these stay behind networks, these secret armies, had actually engaged in terrorism. At that point, um, everything changed in Europe. But our narratives about the Cold War didn't change. It should have caused a recalibration, a reworking of, really what Europe symbolized at the end of the Cold War in terms of democratic institutions and liberal democracies. But these revelations about Gladio came at the exact same time as the countries in the Soviet satellite system were beginning to democratize. So they had to keep a lid on it, or else the plans they had for neoliberalism and globalization, that it wouldn't have worked if there had been a broad knowledge of Operation Gladio. And I believe that were the American public really made aware of these revelations. And in Europe, they were made aware to a limited extent, but it didn't appear in the headlines in the United States. But if Americans hadn't been made aware of Operation Gladio and there had been debates about what this meant and like, how could we have done this to take measures so that it doesn't happen again, if there had been those dialogues in the United States, arguably something like September 11th could not have happened. Now, in the United States, we have a structure. We literally have stay behind armies in the United States. And it's not even a secret. What they do is secret, but their existence isn't secret. It's called COG, Continuity of Government, COG. And they have underground bases, and they do training, and there's this entire paramilitary apparatus throughout the United States, but most notably in Virginia. There's this entire apparatus that's literally a stay-behind army in case something happens, or like a natural disaster or a unnatural disaster or anything. They are there to literally function as a stay-behind army, and they coordinate what's ever going on above ground. And they have weapons caches hidden and all the same stuff as NATO's secret armies during the Cold War. Now, COG, Continuity of Government, they would never be involved in carrying out terrorism and political violence in the United States, would they? I mean, they're just there as in case there's a nuclear bomb attack or in case the White House is incapacitated. They step in that case. But they would never be involved in political assassinations or subterfuge or any kind of false flag terrorism in the United States, would they? Well, actually, there's evidence that they have been involved in all these things. They're literally a secret army, and they're involved in narrative control. And Peter Dale Scott, great researcher, uh, he gave a speech where he talked about how, and he's looked at this, he's written books about this, but he summarized it by saying that COG was very involved during the assassination of JFK. COG, the continuity of government, these paramilitary structures, they were very involved in the Iran-Contra scandal. There was a reference to them in the hearing, the Iran-Contra hearings. There was a reference to COG. And they were also very involved through 9/11. And actually, as a result of 9/11, their prerogatives increased. And there's new legislation dealing with COG and emergency powers, additional emergency powers have been granted to them. So it's all well and good to say, yeah, well, during the Cold War, the communist threat was exaggerated, and we were blind, and but nothing like that would happen again. Like Peter Thiel, when he went on Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan asked him if MK Ultra was still going on, he said, no, I don't think MK Ultra is still going on. And so a lot of people, they treat something like Operation Gladio, when they hear about it, as, oh, that's past, it's Cold War history, but what about now? We would never be so blind as, but the thing is that these operations that were done during the Cold War, they never stopped. It's Operation Gladio 2.0, because now they're not sitting off all these terrorist bombings across Western and Eastern Europe. Turkey was also included. They're setting off bombs in Western Europe, but they're not blaming it on the communists before. They're not blaming it on the communists. They're still setting off the bombs in train stations and public places, but they're blaming it on Islamic terrorists. They're doing mass shootings, Charlie Hebdo shooting in 2017 in France. They're still doing those sort of things, but now it's blamed on Islamic fundamentalists. Mass shootings, cyber attacks, bombing of public infrastructure, the London subways, for example. They're still doing the Madrid hotel bombing. They're still manipulating the narrative using political violence. So it's Operation Gladio 2.0. So that was another reason they had to clamp down on their reporting. But just everything we know about Operation Gladio, it puts it in a whole nother category, because now we're talking about governments in England and France, the United States, actually having a pattern of terrorism and a pattern of political violence. And one of the really hard things about trying to talk about 9/11, even to people in the peace movement who are supposedly bucking the system, that's how they see themselves. One of the hardest things about talking about 9/11 is the comeback that people say, well, they wouldn't do that sort of thing to themselves. They might say, well, yeah, I can see how they could go around the world and kill, 500,000 or a million Iraqis, drop bombs on girls' schools, whatever, but they wouldn't do it here in the United States. And so whenever we're talking about like patterns in history, it's important to know what the historical precedents are. And in order to look at something like 9/11 with an open mind, you have to have some pre-knowledge of how the United States has been involved in false flag terrorism for many years, even going back before World War II. Okay, Operation Gladio, they were doing it to their allies. So if NATO was attacking their allies, seems like that would be very irrelevant for questions about like whether Ukraine gets to be part of NATO? What are the concerns of Russia, and why does Vladimir Putin see Ukraine as an existential threat? See, the pundits in the mainstream news like to laugh. They laugh at Vladimir Putin or the Russian ambassador when they say that um, Europe is escalating in their attacks against Russia, and that they laugh when representatives of the Kremlin say that this war for them is defensive. Russia's special military option is always portrayed as an offensive act of aggression. And a big part of that is the narratives that the West tell about themselves, that they're um, liberal democracies, that they stand for equal rights, for liberalism, for transparency. And it's just such a joke when you look at NATO's past. So how can we talk about NATO's present if we don't talk about NATO's past? And unfortunately, most of the geopolitical commentators that kind of in the podcast realm, they don't want to touch the issue of false flag terrorism with a 10-foot pole. It's become, over the years, it's become such a taboo issue in the peace movement, as well as kind of on the libertarian right. I heard Scott Horton talking the other day on the Elizabeth Lane show, just denigrating 9/11 truthers, as he called them, saying, oh, they're so stupid. Apparently he knows nothing about what he talks about. And he's going on and on about Mohammed Atta, the ringleader. I've just published a piece on Substack, on my Plethora Productions Substack account, about how Mohammed Atta, the supposed 9/11 ringleader, was tied into this entire network of intelligence assets and drug pilots working for the Bush crime family, and how the White House as an institution has been involved in drug trafficking for decades. For decades. So the criminality of Donald Trump is not only in these acts of aggression and the wars and the shooting at ships in the Caribbean, and et cetera, kidnapping the president of Maduro. The crimes of Donald Trump are probably even double, or if not triple, of just the obviousness of what we're confronted with, because he's using the White House and all the resources of the White House to cover up for the narco trafficking of past presidents. So, and he's using the resources of the federal government and the appointment of judges to the benches and everything to continue covering up all the terrorism and all the narco trafficking of the White House as an institution coordinated narco trafficking. So I think it's really important to put this all in perspective. And it might just take a revolution.